this video goes out to the late St. John of the Cross Elementary School in Roslyn, Pennsylvania, where I received my early childhood education, and to which I am forever indebted to the various clergy and educators, wherever you are. I found myself reaching out for the Lord in times of need, and I have been answered time and again, and for this I am thankful. Let's start here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters beneath the earth. Here is the second commandment handed down from Moses to the Israelites upon his descent from Mount Sinai. These people were not allowed to depict themselves. The Mesopotamians showed themselves to us. They wore beards, and they appeared to us generally Middle Eastern. The Egyptians showed themselves to us. They were clean-shaven. The long goatees seen on the pharaohs were false metallic beards. And they appeared to us generally Middle Eastern with some component of sub-Saharan African darker pigmentation. The Greeks showed themselves to us. They appeared to us generally Southern European with some component of Middle Eastern admixture and some component of Northern European lighter pigmentation. The Israelites did not show themselves to us in accordance with Mosaic law. Guess what that means? Everybody gets to be an Israelite, and well, who wouldn't want to be one of God's chosen people? I begin here because I have chosen not to engage the conspiracy theory that proclaims the man called Yeshua an invention of Rome. The historicity of this man is as well documented as that of any Jew of the 1st century AD. Go watch some other channel if you want to go down conspiracy rabbit hole. I deal in reality here. I begin with what he looked like, or possibly looked like. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27. Do not clip your ears. Do not clip your hair at the temples. Do not spoil the edges of your beard. An observation of the Torah, and in common with the fellow men in Mesopotamia, these men of the Levant wore beards, a specific type of beard with long side locks untrimmed, precisely as seen on the side locks of modern-day Orthodox Jews. Later on in Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 25, we see a reference to, quote, those who live in the wilderness and shave their temples, unquote. Well, there's a start. In observation of the Torah, a Jewish man of the 1st century AD would have been bearded with long side locks. Well, we said they weren't allowed to depict themselves, but that didn't stop other people. For a second here, okay. Here's a painting from the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. This has been dated to the 19th century BC. Here we see a family of Semitic traders from the land of Canaan to the east of the Red Sea. If the standard chronology is accepted, this painting would predate Moses and the Mosaic law. We cannot identify these people as followers of the Abrahamic faith, but we can identify them as Semites and note the presence of an inscription which bears a striking similarity to a Hebrew name. Note the relatively lighter pigmentation, the shorter hair, the difference in dress, and the short cropped beards of the men in comparison with the two clean-shaven Egyptians depicted on the upper right. Moving forward 11 centuries into the time when historical testimony can be given to the Israelites. In the 8th century BC, the kingdom of Judah was conquered by a warlike Mesopotamian people called the Assyrians. Here you go. Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat weeping, when we remembered Zion on the poplars in our midst. We hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for the words of a song, our tormentors for joy. Sing for us a song of Zion, but how could we sing a song of the Lord in a foreign land? Where am I here? Now, many details of the Exodus narrative, which wasn't written down until centuries later, are disputed by historians. However, there is a general consensus that there was some movement of the Israelites into Egypt in the second millennium BC. Now, if we suppose these people originating from the land of Canaan had mixed over time with the native Egyptians, and we may assume a somewhat darker pigmentation of the Israelites as they slowly migrated back to their ancestral homeland. Setting aside the historicity of the Exodus narrative per se, can we establish this admixture definitively? No. No, we cannot. But we can look to history and see that wherever one population has migrated to a new area, there was some admixture with the native population. If we assign any historicity to the figure called Moses, which is an Egyptian name, we can find in Exodus chapter 2, verses 16 to 19. Now, the priest of, I'm going to mispronounce so many of these, but it's okay. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them away. So Moses rose up in their defense and watered their flock. When they returned home to their father Ravel, he said to them, "How is it that you have returned so soon today?" They answered, "An Egyptian delivered us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Evidently, then, in the time of the Exodus, usually dated to the 14th or 13th centuries BC, sometimes a couple centuries earlier, a Hebrew could pass for an Egyptian. Moses might have been black. He might have been olive-hued, more typically Middle Eastern in appearance. There's a famous passage where God turns Moses' hand white as a leper. But I sit here as a white man, and there's a white space heater sitting in front of me, and if you made my hand the color of that space heater, it would be a different color. We cannot know if Moses was a black man. He might have been. As to the ethnicity of Jesus, living some 13 centuries later, I find it doubtful that he was a man that we would describe as like African in appearance. Because the settlers of the Levant, who seem to have been the ancestors of the Israelites, seem to have been Middle Eastern in appearance. There was most likely some African admixture among the Hebrews during their time in Egypt, but most likely as a whole they retained part of their original olivey complexion. Now, I don't know of any large-scale migrations of Africans into the Levant during the 13th centuries between Moses and Jesus, but I know of the succeeding imperial conquests of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3, forbids the Israelites for intermarrying with 7 peoples: the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I wouldn't, just for being called the Perizzites, I would want to get at them. But anyway, of which you shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son, unquote. There's all sorts of intermarriage in the Old Testament of the kings of Judah with the foreign priestesses, but the practice seems generally to have been frowned upon among the basic Israelites. If we can assume there was at least some admixture with the above-listed imperial conquerors, I can't help noticing they all get progressively whiter. Now, if you think I'm about to tell you Jesus is white, slow your roll there, homie. Here's the earliest certified depiction of Jesus found anywhere. This is from Rome and might even date to his own century. This is graffiti. In modern day terms, we might call it a political cartoon. I give the creator of this engraving points for effort. Certainly it takes more to etch a drawing into stone than to scribble with a marker in a bathroom stall. But I don't think there's much to take away here. I don't believe he really had the head of a donkey. Here's a depiction from 3rd century of the healing of the paralytic described in the Synoptics. Again, there's little to take away. Here's another Roman image from the 4th century. Here Jesus is flanked by the saints Peter and Paul. I guess by now the Romans were starting to take a liking to him. Now, if we discern more European traits in this depiction, we might bear in mind that this was made by Romans. Finally, here's an image from Cairo, Egypt, from the early Coptic Church. The fact that I haven't been able to date this image definitively tells you something about the Eurocentric course of historiography. But I'm thinking it's somewhere around the early Middle Ages, early medieval period, like Byzantine period. If we discern more African traits in this depiction, we might bear in mind that it was made by Egyptians. Finally, with this Byzantine painting from the 6th or 7th century, we find the earliest established depiction of what we would recognize as the standard Jesus of popular imagination. This would have been created by Middle Eastern Christians some 5 or 6 centuries after his death. This is the same distance in time which separates us from the Italian Renaissance. I quote from Wikipedia: "Images of Jesus tend to show ethnic characteristics similar to those of the culture in which the image has been created." Well, I could have told you that much by quoting from Wikipedia. Now, DNA studies on ancient Judean skeletons have been limited by Orthodox restrictions on unearthing the dead, but what has been revealed seems to indicate that their closest genetic counterpart is modern-day Iraqi Jews. Here is a modern-day Iraqi Jew. Here are a couple of cuter ones. This can give the viewer a basic idea of the likely ethnic characteristics of Jesus and his fellow 1st century Jews. So if we said before that he probably wasn't black, he definitely wasn't this. Why? Because we know who this guy is. This is Cesare Borgia, a 15th century Italian thug from the Borgia crime family who became the standard for all the famous Renaissance depictions of Jesus. You can watch the old Showtime series and find out all about the Borgias if you want. Good looking guy. He had some fella. But he was a no-good thug, and he is the origin of the fair-skinned, long-haired Jesus, which abides in the popular imagination to this day. So what did he look like after all? I quote from the Irish Times. Paul says in his letter to the Corinthian church, "Does not even nature tell you that for a man to have long hair is dishonorable to him? The only exception to that for Jews was if you undertook a Nazirite vow. For this vow you let your hair grow and you didn't drink wine, among other things. John the Baptist was a long-time Nazirite, dedicated by his parents to God, as the Gospel of Luke indicates. But Jesus was not, because he is often found drinking wine." Unquote. Probably had short hair, probably had short beard and side locks. How did he dress? Again from Irish Times. He wore a tunic called a chiton in Greek, or chiton in Greek. Often you would have two, an outer one and a thinner inner one, sometimes called a sindon. An outer tunic in Judea was invariably made of 2 pieces of material, one front and one back, joined at the shoulders and sides with stripes running from shoulder to hem. The inner tunic could be made of one piece. Jesus is said in the Gospel of John to have worn a one-piece tunic. John the Baptist asked people to give away their second tunic. Wouldn't Jesus have done so? In wearing only an inner tunic, he would have been dressed in very basic clothing. Men's tunics were usually knee-high. Long tunics were worn by women or occasionally by wealthy men in high honor positions. But Jesus states, "Beware of the scribes, who desire to walk in long tunics and to have salutations in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. Clearly he is not one of them." End quote. At last, what did people say he looked like? Well, the Gospels give us nothing. I mean nothing. Well, if we entertain the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John might have had some true eyewitness testimony at their disposal, can we then entertain the idea that he might have been unsightly? Fellas, you ever meet the sweetest woman on the face of the earth, but she ain't much to look at? Then you go tell the story about she bandaged up your knee and made you hot cocoa, and somebody asks, well, what did she look like? The Gospels give us nothing, so we gotta look to some quasi-historical material and some apocryphal material if we want to find anything close to a physical description of Jesus. This from the Holosis of the Romano-Jewish historian Josephus, dating to the latter part of the 1st century. A man of simple appearance, mature age, dark skin, small stature, 3 cubits high, that is 4'6", hunchback with a long face, long nose, and meeting eyebrows, so that they who see him might be affrighted, with scanty hair but having a line in the middle of the head after the fashion of the Nazarenes, with an undeveloped beard. I continue from RyanBoysen.com, and these passages compile some of the historical work done in the 20th century by Dr. Robert Eisler. Quote, Nicephorus Callistus also claims that Josephus had described Christ as having been 7 spans, 5 feet 1.5 inches tall, with beautiful eyes, a long nose, 20 hair black eyebrows, and his neck gently bent so that the carriage of his body was not quite upright and rigid. In the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, Christ is referred to as red-faced and of medium height, matching the accounts given above. In the letter of Lentulus, Christ is described as being of medium height with a slightly reddish complexion. He was terrible in his reprimands and was never known to laugh. In a letter of certain bishops to the Emperor Theophilus, Christ's height is described by the epithet tripectus, 3 cubits, which translates to a height of 1.34 meters, 4 feet, 4.7 inches. Tertullian, Celsus, and Acta Johannes Luci all agree that Christ was below medium height. Ephraim Cyrus describes Christ as God took human form and appeared in the form of 3 human elves. He came down to us of small of stature. Zacchaeus had to climb a tree to see Christ because he was small and was being dwarfed by his followers, but I believe it's from the passage, it's not clear if it was Zacchaeus who was small or if it was Christ. Theodore of Matsuphestia likewise records, Thy appearance, O Christ, was smaller than that of the children of Jacob. Tertullian describes Christ in very unflattering terms. Let us compare with Scripture the rest of his dispensation, whatever that poor despised body may be, because it was an object of touch and sight. It shall be my Christ, be he inglorious, be he ignoble, be he dishonored. For such it was announced that he should be, both in bodily condition and aspect. Isaiah comes to our help again. According to the same prophet, however, he is in bodily condition a very worm, and no man, a reproach of men, an outcast of the people. As when they said, Whence has this man this wisdom and these mighty works? Thus spoke even as they who despised his outward form. His body did not reach even to the human body, beauty to say nothing of heavenly glory. Had the prophets given us no information whatever concerning his ignoble appearance, his very sufferings, and the very contumely he endured, to bespeak it all? According to Irenaeus, Christ was described as weak, unattractive, and afflicted. Some of them, moreover, when they predicted that as a weak and inglorious man and as one who knew what it was to bear infirmity. Celsus describes the physique of Christ as little, small, ill-favored, ugly, hideous, and ignoble. In the Acts of Peter we read, Him who is great and quite small, comely and ugly, small for the ignorant, great to those who know him, comely to the understanding and ugly to the ignorant, youthful in age, glorious but amongst us, lowly and ill-favored. According to the Acts of John, John wrote of Christ, he appeared to me again as a rather bald-headed but with a thick flowing beard, but he sometimes appeared to me as a small man with no good looks. St. Augustine states that Christ appeared ugly to his persecutors. Tertullian, denying the appearance of Christ had any beauty, goes so far as stating that the ignominy of the face of Jesus would roar as a witness against the heretics if it could. Now, granted, some of these passages are of dubious authenticity, and others were written by various enemies of the early church, but we can't help drawing a picture in our minds which less resembles the Jesus we're used to from popular representations and more resembles something like this. What you're experiencing right now is the same thing I experienced when first encountering these passages, and that's what's known in psychology as cognitive dissonance. That is the experience of having one's long-held illusions suddenly shattered. Now, let's hold on here for a moment, because if you consider yourself a Christian and you have a mental picture of your Savior looking like this, well, we can establish that this is just some guy from the Renaissance called Cesare Borgia. Well, now you can breathe a sigh of relief because we know who this guy is, too. This, my friends, is a painting of St. Paul the Apostle, the author of several books of the New Testament and arguably the single most important individual after Jesus himself in the establishment of the early church. He was so important, in fact, that it seems to me as if somewhere down the line the physical characteristics of Paul himself become conflated with those of Jesus, because everywhere above we see descriptions which happen to accord perfectly with historical descriptions of Paul, who is a well-documented personage and was consistently noted for his short stature, his reddish complexion, his hunched posture and unattractiveness, and even his unibrow. So, if we can't rely on the Gospels to tell us what Jesus looked like, and if the earliest surviving descriptions we have conflate him with St. Paul, where then can we turn? Folks, I give you the Shroud of Turin, believed by many to be the authentic burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. The article first appeared in the 14th century, and even then, people were calling it a hoax. The matter seemed to be settled in 1988 when radiocarbon dating from a corner piece of the shroud placed it in the Middle Ages. According to Wikipedia, a variety of methods have been proposed for the formation of the image, but the actual method used has not yet been conclusively identified. So is it a hoax? Continuing from Wikipedia, some proponents for the authenticity of the shroud have attempted to discount the radiocarbon dating result by claiming that the sample may represent a medieval invisible repair fragment rather than the image-bearing cloth. In the 1970s, a special 11-member Turin commission conducted several tests. Conventional and electron microscope examination of the shroud at the time revealed the absence of heterogeneous coloring material or pigment. In 1979, scientists, upon analyzing the samples given by STURP, concluded that the image is actually made up of billions of submicrometer pigment particles. The only fibrils that had been available for testing of the stains were those that remained affixed to the custom-designed adhesive tape applied to 32 different sections of the image. Mark Anderson, who was working for Macron, analyzed the shroud samples. In his book, he states that Anderson, who was Macron's Raman microscopy expert, concluded that the samples acted as organic material when he subjected them to the laser. There are several reddish stains on the shroud suggesting blood, but it is uncertain whether these stains were produced at the same time as the image or afterwards. Macron identified these as containing iron oxide, theorizing that its presence was likely due to simple pigment materials used in medieval times. Other researchers, including Alan Adler, identified the reddish stains as blood and interpreted the iron oxide as a natural residue of hemoglobin. Working independently, forensic pathologist Pierluigi Baema-Bellone concluded with Heller and Adler's findings and identified the blood as the AB blood group. Joe Nickel argues that results similar to Heller's and Adler's could be obtained from tempera paint. Skeptics also cite other forensic blood tests whose results dispute the authenticity of the shroud and point to the possibility the blood could belong to a person who handled the shroud and that the apparent blood flows on the shroud are unrealistically neat. In 1997, a botanist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem reported that she had identified several flowers whose pressed image on the shroud was first noticed in 1985 on the photographs of the shroud taken in 1931. It was reported that the outlines of the flowering plants would point to March or April in the environs of Jerusalem. In a separate report in 1978, it was reported on pollen grains on the cloth samples. It was found that they were appropriate to the spring in Israel. A Swiss police criminologist who initially obtained pollen from the shroud during the investigation stated that of the 58 different types of pollens found, 45 were from the Jerusalem area, while 6 were from the Eastern Middle East, with one pollen species growing exclusively in Istanbul, and 2 found in Edessa, Turkey. It has been argued that the pollen evidence and flower images are inherently interwoven and strengthen each other. However, it was subsequently determined that this work was scientifically unsafe, and the scientists have published it thereafter disowned the publication of this work. Skip over this. In 2017, a new examination claimed that the most abundant pollen on the relic may be attributed to the genus Helichrysum. According to the author, palynologist Marzia Boy, it confirms and authenticates the theory that the corpse kept in the shroud received a funeral and burial with all the honor and respect that would have been customary in the Hebrew tradition. Finally, in 2013, an Italian scientist performed new dating studies on fragments obtained from the shroud. He performed 3 different tests, including ATR, FTIR, and Raman spectroscopy, absorption of light of different colors. The date range from these tests ranged to date the shroud between 300 BC and 400 AD, all the above from Wikipedia. So there seems to be some conflicting evidence regarding the date of the shroud. How about the image of the man depicted? Continuing from Wikipedia, a number of studies on the anatomical consistency of the image on the shroud and the nature of the wounds on it have been performed following the initial study in 1902. While it was initially declared that the image was anatomically flawless, others have presented arguments to support both authenticity and forgery. In 1950, a French scientist wrote a long study called A Doctor at Calvary, which was later published as a book. He stated that his experience as a battlefield surgeon during World War I led him to conclude that the image on the shroud was authentic, anatomically correct, and consistent with crucifixion. Over a decade later, Frederick Zagubi performed a number of studies using himself and volunteers suspended from a cross and presented his conclusions in a book in 1998. He considered the shroud image and its proportions as authentic but disagreed on the various details such as blood flow. He concluded that the image on the shroud is of a body of a man, but that the man had been washed. In 2001, Professor Ballone of forensic medicine in Turin stated that the forensic examination of the wounds and bloodstains on the shroud indicate that the image was that of a dead body of a man who was whipped, wounded around the head by a pointed instrument and nailed at the extremities before dying. In 2010, another Italian scientist, professor of mechanical measurements, wrote that apart from the hands afterward placed in the pubic area, the front and back images are compatible with the shroud being used to wrap the body of a man 5'9" tall, give or take, which due to cadaveric rigidity remain in the same position it would have been during crucifixion. A 2013 study analyzed the wounds seemingly evident on the image in the shroud and compared them favorably to the wounds which the Gospels state were inflicted on Jesus. However, the analysis of a crucified Roman discovered near Venice in 2007 shows heel wounds consistent with those found on Jehoanan, and are not consistent with wounds depicted on the shroud. Also, neither of the crucifixion victims known to archaeology show evidence of wrist wounds. Okay. And it's a little more. In 2018, the experimental bloodstain pattern analysis was performed to study the behavior of blood flows from the wounds of a crucified person and to compare this to the evidence on the Torah shroud. The comparisons between different tests demonstrated that the blood patterns on the forearms and on the back of the hand are not connected, would have occurred at different times, and as a result of a very specific sequence of movements. In addition, the rivulets on the front of the image are not consistent with the lines on the lumbar area. Even supposing there might have been different episodes of bleeding at different times, these inconsistencies suggest that the Torah linen was an artistic or didactic representation rather than an authentic burial shroud. Sounds to me like there's some conflicting evidence about this matter as well. I'll tell you what I think. First of all, the image we see here is a photographic negative. The shroud appears to the human eye as thus. It might have been within the means of a skilled forger to produce this image in the 14th century, some 500 years before the development of photography, but something in my gut tells me otherwise. And I say this as a person who would have regarded himself as a skeptic on the shroud before I began this research. But this brings me back to the conflict between scientism and religion, which I've spoken of in previous content. When we speak of scientism, we speak of scientific research conducted with a specific design toward discrediting religion, and when we speak of religion, we speak of faith. It's reasonable to assume that much of the research conducted on this artifact has been slanted in either direction. When the facts in front of me conflict, then I have to trust my eyes, and my eyes tell me, I think this thing might be real. Now, if that's the case, crucifixion was the most common form of execution in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD, so it's still not implausible that this was a burial shroud which originated in the 1st century Judea, and this guy was crucified in the typical fashion, being tied to the cross, and a later artist, perhaps in the medieval period, added the red pigmentation to the cloth to make it resemble the wounds inflicted on Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. This might be a hoax. It might be some random guy, or it might be Jesus of Nazareth. We simply cannot discount the third possibility. And if we so much as entertainment, then this, my friends, is the closest we're going to come to an idea of what he looked like. And what do we see? This man was 5'9" in height, as stated above, give or take an inch, making him 4 inches taller than the average Palestinian man of the 1st century. This accords well with what we typically see in male interactions. People tend to gravitate toward men of taller stature. Leaders tend to be men of relatively higher stature. This man is bearded with what could be the long side locks of Jewish custom. He is sinewy in build, a trait consistent with his reputed trade of carpentry. And although it is difficult to say, judging by a photographic negative, to the naked eye, he would appear to be a man considerably older than the 33 or so years traditionally assigned to him at the time of his crucifixion. Luke says Jesus was about 30 when he began his ministry, but other people don't seem so sure. In John chapter 2, verse 20, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." This temple has been under construction for 46 years, the Jews replied, and you are going to raise it up in 3 days? But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. Unquote. Sure sounds like it was saying he was 46. What else do the Gospels have to say potentially pertaining to this man's age? John chapter 8, verses 57 to 58. Then the Jews said to him, You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? Truly, truly, I tell you, Jesus declared, before Abraham was, I am. Now, if you told a random guy on the street you're not yet 50, it might be assumed that the guy is somewhere in his 40s. But it should be noted that there is significance to the age of 50 in rabbinic law. I quote Numbers chapter 8, verses 23 to 26. The Lord said to Moses, This is the rule for the Levites being the descendants of Levi, the priestly class of the Israelites. Men 25 years old or more shall come to take part in the work of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50, they must retire from the regular service and work no longer. They may assist their brothers in performing their duties at the tent of meeting, but they themselves must not do the work. This, then, is how you are going to assign the responsibilities of the Levites. So, it seems like the ancient Hebrews had some difficulty taking a person who was significantly under the age of 50 seriously as a priest. I quote from the Jerusalem Post. An unknown person who, according to the common Christian belief, was a carpenter and suddenly decided to become a roaming preacher would not in the first century Israel be called a teacher. He would be called a carpenter. The temple authorities would dismiss him as a vagabond. On the contrary, Jesus taught priests and lawyers in the temple many times. Obviously, he had better education about the temple and the law than many of them had. He commanded their attention by his authoritative presentations and cutting reprimands. He called them hypocrites and blind guides. A temple teacher must not only have deep learning, but also an authentic pedigree to even enter the holy place. Genealogies were checked at the outer gates. He could not enter to teach priests if he had not fulfilled the requirements of the priest himself. Unquote. Now, returning to the Gospels, we recall that Luke says Jesus was about 30 when he begins his ministry. John, on the other hand, seems to have Jesus state explicitly that at least at one point in the course of ministry, he was 46 years old. Well, it's implicit in there. He didn't say it, but the Pharisees at the temple repeated it back to him. Said this temple's been building 46 and 40 years. So there are varying estimates of the length of Jesus' ministry as recorded in Scripture, but nobody anywhere is claiming a length of anywhere near the 16 years that this gap would require. So having provided the viewer with as clear an idea as I can from the evidence at my disposal of Jesus' likely appearance, I now turn to the second question at his hands. What were his dates? When was he born and when did he die? Okay, now, in the prologue, Luke makes clear that he intends to report history. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first eyewitnesses were and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you. Yeah, Luke gets a lot of things wrong. In chapter 2, he tells us that Jesus was born during the census of Quirinius, but he also seems to concur with Matthew that the nativity took place during the reign of Herod the Great. This presents us with an anachronism because there's plenty of historical documentation which dates the census to 86 and the dates the death of Herod to 4 BC, a gap of 9 years. Now, all four Gospels, as well as the historian Josephus, are in agreement that the crucifixion took place during the prefect of Pontius Pilate in Judea. This places it squarely within the years AD 26 to AD 36. Luke tells us that John the Baptist began his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius was the second Roman emperor, ascending to the throne after the death of Augustus in August AD 14. This means that John would have started preaching sometime between late AD 28 and late AD 29. So if we believe Luke on this one, that narrows down our span to the years 29 to 36 for the span of Jesus' ministry, which followed after John's. If Luke is accurate about the census, then this means Jesus would have had to have started preaching late in the prefect of Pilate in order to be considered about 30. On the other hand, if the nativity occurred as late as possible in the reign of Herod, and if Jesus began preaching later the same year as John by Luke's account, this gives us a lower limit of the age of 32 for Jesus at the start of his ministry. So what does the other evangelist Matthew have to say about the birth of Jesus? Matthew chapter 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are coming to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when they had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where the Christ should be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod had his privily called wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. And thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, as exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years and under, according to the time which he had diligently required of the wise men. Then was fulfillment that which spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, In Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they are not. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he returned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, Matthew seems to be fitting in his nativity narrative with the prophecies of Isaiah and Micah, who tell us the Messiah will be a Hebrew man. That's Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. Born in Bethlehem. That's from Micah 5:2. Of a virgin. Again, Isaiah 7:14. And he also seems to echo the birth narrative of Moses described in the opening of Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 to 22. And the kings of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. If it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded, but saved the men, children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, What have ye done this thing, and have saved the men of children alive? And the midwives said unto the Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and delivered ere their midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mightily. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Now, the other two canonical Gospels, Mark and John, are silent on the Nativity. So what are we to make of these respective accounts of Matthew and Luke? Well, there's a general scholarly consensus that Luke postdates both Matthew and Mark. This accords with the ordering of the Gospels in the New Testament. So if we suppose Matthew fitted his narrative to align with prophecy and to mirror the Moses story, which also takes place under the reign of a murderous tyrant who orders the massacre of male infants, and that Luke followed suit with some faulty chronology, where does that leave us in our pursuit of an accurate chronology of the life of Jesus? Let's suppose for a moment that there could be some legitimacy to the story of the flight into the Egypt. Let's talk about King Herod. From Wikipedia, Herod, also known as Herod the Great and Herod the First, was a Roman client king of Judea, referred to as the Herodian Kingdom. Herod spent lavish sums on his various building projects and generous gifts to other dominions, including Rome itself. Although he made many attempts at conforming to traditional Jewish laws, there were more instances where Herod was insensitive, which constitutes one of the major Jewish complaints towards Herod as highlighted in Jewish antiquities. In Jerusalem, Herod introduced foreign forms of entertainment and erected a golden eagle at the entrance of the temple, which suggested a greater interest in the welfare of Rome than of Jews. Herod's taxes garnered a bad reputation. His constant concern for his reputation led him to make frequent expensive gifts, emptying the kingdom's coffers, and such lavish spending upset his Jewish subjects. The two major Jewish sects of the day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, both showed opposition to Herod. The Pharisees were discontented because Herod disregarded many of their demands with respect to the temple's construction. The Sadducees, who were closely associated with the priestly responsibilities in the temple, opposed Herod because he replaced their high priests with outsiders from Babylonia and Alexandria in an effort to gain support from the Jewish diaspora. Herod's outreach efforts gained him little, and at the end of his reign, anger and dissatisfaction were common among Jews. Heavy outbreaks of violence and riots followed Herod's death in many cities, including Jerusalem. As pent-up resentments boiled over, the scope of the disturbances sparked hopes that the Jews of Judea might someday overthrow the Roman overlords. Hopes reawakened decades later in the outbreak of the Great Revolt of AD 70. Scholars agree Herod suffered throughout his lifetime from depression and paranoia. Josephus stated that Herod was so concerned that no one would mourn his death that he commanded a large group of distinguished men to come to Jericho, and he gave an order that they should be killed at the time of his death, so that the displays of grief that he craved would take place. But his son Archelaus and his sister Salome did not carry out this wish, unquote. So we have historical evidence for a murderous mad king, and for a general atmosphere of chaos in the final years of his reign and immediately following his death. Matthew seems to think that the family of Jesus was originally from Judea, the area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and relocated to Galilee, the area of Nazareth, after returning from Egypt, whereas Luke seems to think they were originally from Nazareth. In either event, it's not a far cry to assume that people were trying to flee during this period. Egypt, according to Wikipedia, was a logical place to find refuge as it was outside the dominions of King Herod. But both Egypt and Judea were part of the Roman Empire, linked by a coastal road known as the Way of the Sea, making travel between them easy and relatively safe. Now, Nazareth was a tiny village unattested in any literature predating the time of Jesus, but it was situated near the Via Maris, the main road connecting to Egypt, and that was also just north of a larger town called Sepphoris. Historians have noted that Sepphoris has been, quote, largely destroyed in the violence after the death of Herod the Great. At this time, it was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas, Herod's heir in Galilee, and this could have been a source of employment for a carpenter such as Jesus' father Joseph, to paraphrase from Wikipedia. So here's where we're at. We've opened up the possibility that Jesus was somewhat older at the start of his ministry than is popularly assumed. But we've also kept the door open for some element of historicity into the Flight of Egypt narrative related to Matthew. Now let's return to John chapter 2, verse 20, where an age of 46 years is seemingly assigned to both the Second Temple of Jerusalem and Jesus himself. From Wikipedia, construction of the temple under Herod began with a massive expansion of the Temple Mount. Herod's work on the temple is generally dated from 20 or 19 BC until 12 or 11 BC or 10 BC. Writer Beek Mayhew dates the work on the temple enclosures from 25 BC and that on the temple buildings in 19 BC, and situates the dedication of both in November 18 BC. On September 25, 2007, archaeologists with the Israel Antiquities Authority announced the discovery of a quarry compound which may have provided King Herod with the stones to build his temple on the Temple Mount. Coins, pottery, and an iron stake found proved the date of the quarrying to be about 19 BC, unquote. Now, it's worrisome that Luke, and when I speak of the evangelist by name, it's for the sake of brevity. I don't necessarily subscribe to the traditional authorship. It's worrisome that Luke gets the birth date of Jesus so evidently wrong. However, he doesn't ascribe any particular date to the census of Quirinius, but he's very precise about the ministry of John the Baptist beginning in the 15th year of Tiberius. Now, John was preaching in Judea, in the area around Jerusalem, and was very close to the hub of Jewish culture where Jesus resided in and preached in the area of, whereas Jesus resided in and preached in the area of Galilee, which is a relative backwater to the north. It's reasonable to suppose that Luke had some first-hand documentation on the ministry of John at hand, which he did not have in regard to Jesus. So let's suppose Luke is correct on this one. That is the AD 28 to 29 date for the start of John's ministry. Now, if we suppose the Jews were dating the start of the temple construction to its dedication in November 18 BC, we can see that it was 46 years in construction during the period of AD 29 to 30. And this date accords well with other evidence in the Gospels that Jesus began his ministry in Galilee not long after John the Baptist, and accords well with the temple episode mentioned above in John chapter 2, in which John seems to place at quite an early stage in his ministry. Now, let's return to the later passage in John from chapter 8. You are not yet 50 years old. You have seen Abraham. At a glance, this remark leads one to believe that Jesus might have been over 40, but still young enough to be unmistakably under 50, perhaps somewhere in his early to mid-40s. But if we suppose this incident originated with some first-hand source material that was later edited out, what if we suppose that? That is, what if the original account John was working with started with the rabbis asking Jesus his age and Jesus responding 48 or 49 or something, Continuing our effort at synchronization with Luke, this would place this incident somewhere in the range of AD 32 to 33 and would seem to align well with John's chronology. Certain authors in the early church seem to concur with an older Jesus. Irenaeus, in particular, in his Against Heresy, says 30 eons are not typified by the fact that Christ was baptized in his 30th year. He did not suffer in the 12th month after his baptism, but was more than 50 years old when he died. Irenaeus considered it a heresy that Jesus was a young man when he died, and even goes so far as to make him over 50. When I weigh all this in the balance with the apparent reverence of the first century Jews for old age and wisdom, and the unlikelihood of a man in his early 30s being taken as seriously upon entering the temple of Jerusalem as Jesus seems to have been taken, the image presented to me on the Shrouded Torn, which we've discovered might actually be authentic, comes back to mind. So finally, in making my assessment of Jesus' likely age at the time of his ministry, I summon what's called the criterion of embarrassment. And that's basically what that means is, if this was a younger man, we wouldn't have any evidence pointing to the possibility that it was an older man. The massacre of the innocent smacks of something somebody inserted an interpolation to fulfill prophecy. Luke appears to have been writing for a Greco-Roman audience, and they all kind of had this idolatry going on with the youthful gods like Apollo and Adonis. In fact, some of the earliest Greco-Roman depictions of Jesus are of this youthful Greek god-looking figure. Sorry if all this sounds like conjecture, but we have so little to go on here that we kind of got to use our gut. Certainly there's some truth in the gospel. Certainly there's some, shall we say, artistic license, and we got to kind of sift the wheat from the chaff. So let's try to coordinate some of the chronology here. If Luke knew for a fact that John's ministry started when he says it does, and if John knew, as he seems to indicate, that Jesus was the same age as the temple, and if we suppose the Jews were dating the temple from the time of its dedication, that puts Jesus' date of birth somewhere in a range of 18 to 17 BC. Yeah, I have a feeling the Romans made it December 25th to align with the pagan festival of Saturnalia, but who knows? So there you go. I told you as close we're going to get with the evidence presently at hand to what the guy looked like, and it's this thing. Maybe a medieval forgery, maybe another guy who got crucified and they put red paint on him to give him the stigmata. Maybe, just maybe, the face of our Christian Messiah. Now I told you that as close we're going to get to when he was born. Best I can give you, and boy is it sketchy. Now, thanks to the Almighty, wherever it lies, that I feel comfortable enough to sit here and tell you when I believe he was crucified. I believe the crucifixion took place on April 3rd, AD 33. Once again, turning with our limited scope, our limited attention spans, our limited time, and turn to the people who have devoted their academic work to this endeavor. I give you from ChristianEvidence.net. I begin with the assigned clue number 4 because it so happens we've already covered the first 3 clues. Clue number 4, crucified on a Friday. All 4 Gospels agree that Jesus was crucified on a Friday. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just before a Sabbath, which was just before the first day of the week. We know it was a Friday because it is referred to as the day of preparation. That is the day on which the Jews made the preparations they needed for the Sabbath, since they could not do any work on that day. That eliminates 6 of the days of the week. But there were still quite a few Fridays between AD 29 and AD 36. Clue number 5, a Friday at Passover. The Gospels also agree that Jesus was crucified in conjunction with the annual feast of Passover. When describing the morning of Good Friday, John indicates that the Jewish authorities had not yet eaten a Passover meal. John chapter 18, verses 28 to 29. Then they led Jesus from the house of I still can't say that, Caiaphas, to the Praetorium, Pilate's palace. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them. That suggested the Passover would have begun on sundown Friday. They were celebrating a Passover beginning on what we would call Friday evening. That lets us narrow down the range of possible dates to just a few. Here is a complete list of the days between AD 29 and 36 on whose evenings Passover begins. Monday, April 28th, Monday, April 18th, AD 29. Friday, April 7th, AD 30. Tuesday, March 27th, AD 31. Monday, April 14th, AD 32. Friday, April 3rd, 33 AD. Wednesday, March 24th, AD 34. Tuesday, April 12th, AD 35. Saturday, March 31st, AD 36. As you can see, we have only just two candidates left. Jesus was either crucified on April 7th of AD 30 or April 3rd of AD 33. Clue number 6. John's 3 Passovers. The Gospel of John records 3 different Passovers during Jesus' ministry. This is recorded in John 2:13 near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is recorded in John 6:4 in the middle of Jesus' ministry. This is recorded in John 11:55 and frequently mentioned afterwards at the end of Jesus' ministry. This means that the ministry of Jesus had to span something over 2 years. A fuller treatment will reveal that it spanned about 3.5 years, but even if we assume it began immediately before Passover number 1, the addition of 2 more Passovers shows that it lasted more than 2 years at a bare minimum. That means the AD 30 date is out. There is not enough time between the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, AD 29, and the next year's Passover to accommodate a ministry of at least 2 years. The numbers don't add up. The date of Jesus' death must be April 3rd, AD 33. Clue number 7, the 9th hour. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each record Jesus died at about the 9th hour. The 9th hour is what we today will refer to as 3 p.m. This allows us to narrow down the time of Jesus' death to a very specific point in history around 3 p.m. on Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. So this is when it happened, unquote. As for starters, the article I just quoted from presupposes the historicity of John, and the 3 or perhaps more Passovers recorded in the Gospel of John. The 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only record his baptism by John, his ministry in Galilee, and a single trip to Jerusalem culminating in the cleansing of the temple and the subsequent crucifixion. It's not impossible to draw a picture from the 3 synoptics of a ministry lasting perhaps 1 year or less, and favor the earlier date of AD 30 for the crucifixion. This would mean things are moving pretty quickly from the beginning of John's ministry to all the way to the death of Jesus. All this would have taken place within the span of a single year. Now we're going to delve into this a bit more later, but if Jesus was a great miracle worker going around healing the lepers and exorcising the unclean spirits and turning water into wine, it's not inconceivable that he could have built up a great following in a very short amount of time. And this would even account for some of the contradictions in the Gospels, and for the lack of any concrete physical description of the man if his entire ministry unfolded within the span of a single year. The accounts would be thin. So we have a pair of chronological events on which all 4 canonical Gospels are in agreement: the baptism by John and the crucifixion under Pilate. Let's take a closer look at the governorship of Pontius Pilate from Wikipedia. Various disturbances during Pilate's governorship are recorded in the sources. In some cases, it is unclear if they may be referring to the same event, and it is difficult to establish a chronology of events for Pilate's rule. Joan Taylor argues that Pilate had a policy of promoting the imperial cult, which may have caused some friction with his Jewish subjects. Schwartz suggests that Pilate's entire tenure was characterized by continuing underlying tension between governor and governed, now and again breaking out in brief incidents. According to Josephus in his The Jewish War, Antiquities of the Jews. Pilate offended the Jews by moving imperial standards with the image of Caesar into Jerusalem. This resulted in a crowd of Jews surrounding Pilate's house in Caesarea for 5 days. Pilate then summoned them to an arena where the Roman soldiers drew their swords, but the Jews showed so little fear of death that Pilate relented and removed the standards. Bond argued that the fact that Josephus says that Pilate brought in the standards by night shows that he knew that the images of the emperor would be offensive. She dates this incident to early in Pilate's tenure as governor. As Daniel Schwartz and Alexander DeMant both suggest that this incident is in fact identical with the incident with the shields reported in Philo's embassy to Gaius, an identification first made by the early church historian Eusebius. Lemonnier, however, argues against this identification. According to Philo's embassy to Gaius, Pilate offended against Jewish law by bringing golden shields into Jerusalem and placing them on Herod's palace. The sons of Herod the Great petitioned him to remove the shields, but Pilate refused. Herod's sons then threatened to petition the emperor, an action which Pilate feared that would expose the crimes he had committed in office. He did not prevent their petition. Tiberius received the petition and angrily reprimanded Pilate, ordering him to remove the shields. Helen Bond, Daniel Schwartz, and Warren Carter argue that Philo's portrayal is largely stereotyped and rhetorical, portraying Pilate with the same words as the opponents of Jewish law, while portraying Tiberius as just and supportive of Jewish law. It is unclear why the shields offended against Jewish law. It is likely that they contained an inscription referring to Tiberius as son of divine Augustus. Bond dates the incident to AD 31, sometime after Sejanus' death, in October 17th. Who is Sejanus? How do we say his name? Sejanus was an ambitious soldier, friend, and confidant of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. An equestrian by birth, Sejanus rose to power as prefect of the Roman imperial bodyguard, known as the Praetorian Guard, of which he was commander from AD 14 until his death in AD 31. Some more info from Xenos.org. In AD 26, Tiberius retired to the remote and almost inaccessible island of Capri, never to return to Rome again. Sejanus had played a major role in convincing Tiberius to do this. He also proved his total loyalty to Tiberius by shielding Tiberius with his own body during a cave collapse that year. While still retaining his full imperial authority, he left Sejanus at Rome as his agent. From this point on, Sejanus' power increased dramatically. He was not only Tiberius' spokesman, which made the senators curry his favor, he also carefully controlled all communications to Tiberius on Capri. In this way, Sejanus was able to prey on Tiberius' fears of revolt and use him to eliminate the legitimate successors of Tiberius. Whether Sejanus was actively aspiring to become emperor or only seeking to eliminate possible heirs so that he would not be eliminated by them when they came into power is not clear. What is clear is that he used his position to eliminate them. Tiberius retired to Capri sometime in AD 26. The exact date is not known, but because of the above data, it is very likely that Pilate was sent after Tiberius retired. In that case, he was appointed by Sejanus. Even if he was appointed slightly before Tiberius retired, it is likely that Sejanus was still the main influence behind the appointment, since Tiberius had granted considerable authority to Sejanus in these kinds of matters by this time. Unquote. Here is a contemporary account of the rule of Sejanus from Philo of Alexandria. Therefore, everyone everywhere, even if he was not naturally well disposed toward the Jews, was afraid to engage in destroying any of our institutions. And indeed, it was the same under Tiberius, though matters in Italy became troublesome when Sejanus was organizing his onslaughts. For Tiberius knew the truth. He knew at once after Sejanus' death that the accusations made against the Jewish inhabitants of Rome were false slanders invented by him because he wished to make away with the nation, knowing that it would take the sole or the principal part in opposing his unholy plots and actions, and would defend the emperor where in danger of becoming a victim of treachery. And he charged his procurators in every place to which they were appointed to speak comfortably to the members of our nations in the different cities, assuring them that the penal measures did not extend to all, but only to the guilty, who were few, and to disturb none of the established customs, but even to regard them as trust committed to their care, the people as naturally peaceable, and the institutions as influence promoting orderly conduct. Well, somewhere down the line, Sejanus and Tiberius had a falling out, and the exiled empire sends a letter to Rome demanding the prefect's immediate arrest. Sejanus is tried and executed in October AD 31. Looking at the chronology, it's easy to see how Pilate might have been an appointment of Sejanus, and how his early persecutory attitude toward the Jews might have been an extension of the policies of his superior. If we follow the logic here, it's easy to see how Pilate might have had to tone it down a bit and sort of make good with the residents of Judea after the fall of Sejanus. This, combined with the sheer multitude of events and travels related in all four Gospels, is what ultimately convinces me of the latter date of April 3rd, AD 33 for the crucifixion of Jesus. So let me scope out my general conception of this man's life so far considered, and it's just a creative conception. There's some necessary invention involved because of the conflicting source material. But here goes. He is born perhaps in Nazareth to a Nazarene family, or perhaps in Judea near Jerusalem on the first night of the Feast of Tabernacles, on the evening of October 7th to 8th, 18 BC. This would account for the family's trip to either Bethlehem or Jerusalem in observance of the holiday, and would doubly account for the no room at the inn story, as many of these pilgrimagers would be arriving to see the dedication of Herod's temple. He then spends his childhood to about age 13, either in Nazareth or somewhere in Judea, and he flees with his mother Mary and father Joseph across the Via Maris into Egypt, along with many other refuge seekers in the anarchy following the death of Herod. Eventually, word spreads to Egypt, perhaps in the latter part of 3 BC, that order has been restored in the lands of Judah and Israel, and Joseph then finds carpentry work for himself and his now teenage son in the destroyed town of Sepphoris. Eventually, they settle, or perhaps resettle, in Nazareth, where Jesus spends the next 10 years or so working as a carpenter under his father. This takes us all the way up to 9 AD to a 25-year-old Christ. Then we do not hear from him again for 20 years. Yes, the missing 18 years have been expanded here to 20, where we can only suppose he went off and learned whatever it was that made him Christ. I bet you he went a lot of places and learned a lot of things. Came into contact perhaps with some magi. When he reemerges, it is from the wilderness after a feast of 40 days and 40 nights. He is now 45 years old. And that's my invented chronology. Matthew 3:13, then cometh Jesus from Galilee to Jordan unto John to be baptized of him. He then returns to Galilee and begins his ministry in October of that year, concurrent with his 46th birthday. The following Passover, he creates a great stir at the temple in his annual visit to Jerusalem. The Pharisees declare him banned for life. He goes back up to Galilee and spends the next 3 years amassing a church of believers in his word. As the Passover season of AD 33 approaches, Jesus is in his 50th year. The Nazarene and his disciples begin the long final march south to Jerusalem. He rides into town on a donkey in fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. And so begins Passion Week. He arrives at the temple, casts out the money changers in a rare fit of aggression. Can't say I blame him. In enjoys the Last Supper of bread and wine with his 11 loyal apostles, and another corrupted with his 30 pieces of silver, and is apprehended later that evening by his betrayer Judas Iscariot with an armed mob of Roman soldiers and angry Jewish citizens, and is taken to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, where he is interrogated and beaten. The following morning he is sent to the court of Pilate, where he is tried and convicted with what would not appear to have been due process of law, and he meets his maker on the cross at Calvary at 3 p.m. on the afternoon of Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. We shall move on to our third question. Was this man the Jewish Messiah? Let me phrase this properly. Did this man fulfill the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament? No. Slow your roll there, homie. I didn't say he wasn't the Christian Messiah. I didn't say he couldn't fulfill your concept of a savior. I merely intend to state that this man literally did not fulfill the clearly stated prerogatives of the Jewish Messiah. I need to go no further than the etymology from Wikipedia. In Jewish eschatology, the term Messiah or Messiah refers specifically to a future Jewish king from the Davidic line who is expected to save the Jewish nation and will be appointed with holy anointing oil and rule the Jewish people during the Messianic age. The Messiah is often referred to as King Messiah, or in Hebrew, Melech, Messiah, in Aramaic, Malka, Mashiach. In a generalized sense, Messiah has the connotation of a savior or redeemer who would appear at the end of days and usher in the kingdom of God, the restoration of Israel, or whatever dispensation was considered to be the ideal state of the world. Messianism denotes a movement or a system of beliefs and ideas centered on the expectation of the advent of the Messiah. Orthodox views hold that the Messiah will be descended from his father through the line of King David and will gather the Jews back into the land of Israel, usher in the era of peace, build the third temple, father a male heir, reinstitute the Sanhedrin, and so on. The Jewish tradition of the late or post-Second Temple period alludes to two redeemers, one suffering and the second fulfilling the traditional messianic role, namely Messiah ben Yosef and Messiah ben David. In general, the term Messiah unqualified refers to Messiah ben David. Belief in the future advent of the Messiah is one of the fundamental requisites of the Jewish faith, concerning which Maimonides has written, "Anyone who does not believe in him or who does not wait for his arrival has not merely denied the other prophets, but has also denied the Torah and Moses, our rabbi." Jesus simply did not fulfill the messianic prophecy of the Jews, and so how's about we forgive these people for believing their own scripture as those in the Christian faith have believed theirs? Okay, that's out of the way. Easy peasy. Praise. All right, brings us to question number 4. Did this man fulfill his own prophecy of rising from the dead in 3 days? Was he resurrected? And would you believe it? I regard it as the most frivolous thing we're going to have to deal with. Frivolous in the end, but it might wind up freaking you out just a bit. Brace yourself. We got some theories floating around. We got some gossip. Let's backtrack a little bit here. So the Gospel of Mark, traditionally assigned to this guy John Mark, a Greco-Roman companion of St. Peter, who would have spoken Aramaic, and quite possibly the literal Gospel of St. Peter as related to his Greek-speaking scribe. And why wouldn't it be? The guy was around. It's hard to believe he didn't leave some kind of document. St. Paul was around writing all sorts of stuff. Certainly our first pope would want to have his say as well. I've dealt with scientism as something distinct from the scientific endeavor. That's just a fight that's been going on between the church and academia for some 500 years. I think it's time academia stopped being such sore winners. You win. God is gone, and we have only knowledge to guide us in our morals. And look where it's getting us. The church is a mess. Organized religion as a whole is a mess. And so it would appear is organized human life in the absence of any kind of universally agreed upon moral precepts. Now, you people have the high ground. You want to let God back in? Because God's going to win if you keep fighting. I'm confident that's the case, but I digress. From Wikipedia. The earliest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark and at Mark, the earliest reliable manuscripts of Mark and at Mark 16:8 with the women fleeing in fear from the empty tomb. The majority of recent scholars believe this to be the original ending. It's Mark chapter 16, verse 8. And this is supported by statements from the early church fathers, Eusebius and Jerome. 2 attempts were made to provide a more satisfactory conclusion. A minority of later manuscripts have what is called the shorter ending, in addition to Mark 16:8, telling how the women told those around Peter all that the angel had commanded, and how the message of eternal life or proclamation of eternal salvation was then sent out by Jesus himself. So this is the original ending of Mark. What we're experiencing now is cognitive dissonance, of the sort I spoke of earlier, and there's more to come. Was Peter trying to tell us something? Did the apostles, or merely a small group of apostles, abduct the body of Jesus in order to fulfill the prophecy of resurrection? There's the infamous swoon hypothesis from Mark chapter 15, verses 42 to 45. Now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled that he was already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Now, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if the guy took sooner to die than average on account of the fact that he was reportedly nailed to the cross, whereas in a typical arrangement, you had the guy merely tied to the cross. But Pilate seems to have been surprised, and I can't say to what extent that speaks to general ineptitude of the Roman leadership in Judea circa AD 33. But here we have this idea that Jesus didn't actually die on a cross. He simply passed out and was pronounced dead, and later came to and was perhaps nursed back to health by his apostles, and some Pilate apologists even go so far as to involve a sympathetic Roman prefect in this benevolent conspiracy, if you want to call it that. Well, given a choice between the two possibilities I listed above, I can't help leaning toward the former, in which case he was actually dead and his body was abducted overnight by the apostles. This brings us to our third option, the fulfillment of that prophecy of resurrection on the third day, on which miracle the entire Christian faith seems to hang its hat. A lot of people said they seen him, a lot of people. And I got news for you, mainstream science. When enough people experience something, it means it happened. This has been revealed going on some 100 years now in discoveries of quantum mechanics. We create the reality before us. Call it mass hallucination if you like. But it appears that we're all hallucinating everything in front of us, and it sure does seem to me like the rest of the sciences have yet to catch up with the highest science, which is physics, which is the study of everything that exists. And now my question, does the resurrection alone denote that this man was the Messiah? Could he have been a sorcerer? Come down with me along what I find to be this necessary road of cognitive dissonance as we trod through the pathless land of truth. And I promise you this will all end on a positive note. I give you the well-documented tale of what may very well have been a sorcerer close to our own times. That is the tale of the Russian peasant Grigory Rasputin from Wikipedia. Where it airs, fix it. Rasputin first met the Tsar on 1 November 1905 at the Peterhof Palace. The Tsar recorded the event in his diary, writing he and Alexandra had made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigory, from Tobolsk province. Rasputin would not meet the Tsar and his wife again for some months. He returned to Prakistoy shortly after their first meeting and did not return to St. Petersburg until July 1906. On his return, Rasputin sent Nicholas a telegram asking to present the Tsar with an icon of Simeon of Virkutyre. He met with Nicholas and Alexandra on 18 July and again in October when he first met their children. At some point, the royal family became convinced that Rasputin possessed the power to heal Alexei. But historians disagree over when. According to Orlando Figes, Rasputin was first introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina as a healer who could help their son in November 1905, while Joseph Furman has speculated that it was in October 1906 Rasputin was first asked to pray for the health of Alexei. Alexandra Fyodorovna and her children Rasputin and the nurse Marie Ivanovna Vishnikova. Much of Rasputin's influence with the royal family stemmed from the belief by Alexander and others that he had eased the pain and stopped the bleeding of the Tsarevich, who suffered from hemophilia on several occasions. According to historian Mark Farrow, the Tsarina had a passionate attachment to Rasputin as a result of her belief that he could heal her son's affliction. Harold Schuckman wrote that Rasputin became an indispensable member of the royal entourage as a result. Rasputin has been rumored to be capable of faith healing since his arrival in St. Petersburg, and the Tsarina's friend Anna Vyrabova became convinced that Rasputin had miraculous powers shortly thereafter. Vyrabova would become one of Rasputin's most influential advocates. It is unclear when Rasputin first learned of Alexei's hemophilia or when he first acted as a healer for Alexei. He may have been aware of Alexei's condition as early as 1906 and was summoned by Alexandra to pay for Alexei when he had an internal hemorrhage in the spring of 1907. Alexei recovered the next morning. During the summer of 1912, Alexei developed a hemorrhage in his thigh and groin after a jolting carriage ride near the royal hunting grounds at Spala, which caused a large hematoma. In severe pain and delirious with fever, the Tsarevich appeared close to death. In desperation, the Tsarina and asked Vyrova to send Rasputin, who was in Siberia, a telegram asking him to pray for Alexei. Rasputin wrote back quickly, "Tell the Tsarina that God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve, the little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The next morning, Alexei's condition was unchanged, but Alexei was encouraged by the message and regained some hope that Alexei would survive. Alexandra was encouraged. Alexei's bleeding stopped the following day. Historian Robert K. Massey has called Alexei's discovery one of the most mysterious episodes of the whole Rasputin legend. The cause of his recovery is unclear. Massey speculated that Rasputin's suggestion not to let doctors disturb Alexei had aided his recovery by allowing him to rest and heal, or that his message may have aided Alexei's recovery by calming Alexandra and reducing the emotional stress on Alexei. Alexandra, however, believed that Rasputin had performed a miracle and concluded that he was essential to Alexei's survival. Some writers and historians such as Farrow has claimed that Rasputin stopped bleeding on other occasions through hypnosis. The royal family's belief that Rasputin possessed the power to heal Alexei brought him considerable status and power at court. The Tsar appointed Rasputin his lamplighter, who was charged with keeping the lamps lit that burned in front of the religious icons in the palace, and he thus had regular access to the palace and royal family. By December 1906, Rasputin had become close enough to the royal family to ask a special favor of the Tsar, that he be permitted to change his surname to Rasputin Novyi, Rasputin New. Nicholas granted the request, and the name change was speedily processed, suggesting that the Tsar viewed and treated Rasputin favorably at the time. Rasputin used his status and power to full effect, accepting bribes and sexual favors from admirers and working diligently to expand his influence. He soon became a controversial figure. He was accused by his enemies of religious heresy and rape, and was suspected of exerting undue political influence over the Tsar, and was even rumored to be having an affair with the Tsarina. Alternative religious movements had become popular among the city's aristocracy before Rasputin's arrival in St. Petersburg in 1903, such as spiritualism and theosophy, and many of the aristocracy were intensely curious about the occult and the supernatural. The St. Petersburg elite were fascinated by Rasputin, but did not widely accept him. He did not fit in with the royal family, and he had a very strained relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. The Holy Synod frequently attacked Rasputin, accusing him of a variety of immoral or evil practices. World War I, the disappearance of feudalism, and a meddling government bureaucracy all contributed to Russia's declining economy at a very rapid rate. Many laid the blame with Alexandra and with Rasputin because of his influence over her. Here is an example. Vladimir Purishkevich was an outspoken member of the Duma. On 19 November 1916, Purishkevich made a rousing speech in the Duma in which he stated, "The Tsar's ministers who have been turned into marionettes whose threads have been taken firmly in hand by Rasputin, and the Empress Alexandra Fyodorova, the evil genius of Russia, and the Tsarina, who have remained a German on the Russian throne and alien to the country and its people." Felix Yusupov attended this speech and afterwards contracted Purishkevich, which quickly agreed to participate in the murder of Rasputin. One too many Russian names. Rasputin's influence over the royal family was used against him and the Romanovs by politicians and journalists who wanted to weaken the integrity of the dynasty, forced the Tsar to give up his absolute political power and separate the Russian Orthodox Church from the state. On July 9, 1914, a 33-year-old peasant woman named Chiona Guseva attempted to assassinate Rasputin by stabbing him in the stomach outside his home in Pokrovskoye. Rasputin was seriously wounded, and for a time it was not clear he would survive. After surgery and after some time in a hospital in Tyumen, he recovered. Guseva was a follower of Iodor, a former priest who had supported Rasputin before denouncing his sexual escapades and self-aggrandizement in December 1911. A radical conservative and anti-Semite, Iodor had been part of a group of establishment figures who had attempted to drive a wedge between the royal family and Rasputin in 1911. When this effort failed, Iodor was banished from St. Petersburg and was ultimately defrocked. Guseva claimed to have acted alone, having read about Rasputin in the newspaper and believing him to be a false prophet and even the Antichrist. Both the police and Rasputin, however, believed that Iodor had played the same role in the attempt on Rasputin's life. Iodor fled the country before he could be questioned about the assassination attempt, but Guseva was found to be not responsible for her actions due to insanity. According to his daughter, Rasputin was very much changed by the experience and began to drink alcohol. Felix Yusupov married the Tsar's niece in 1914. A group of nobles led by Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich decided that Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina had made him a threat to the empire, and they concocted a plan in December 1916 to kill him, apparently by luring him to the Yusupov's Moika Palace. Dori Bolshoi Petrovsky Bridge, from which Rasputin's body was thrown into the Malaya Nevka River. Rasputin was murdered during the early morning on 30 December 1916 at the home of Felix Yusupov. He died of 3 gunshot wounds, one of which was a close-range shot to the forehead. Little is known about his death beyond this, and the circumstances of his death have been the subject of considerable speculation. According to historian Douglas Smith, what really happened at the Yusupov home on December 17th will never be known. The story that Yusupov recounts in his memoirs, however, has become the most frequently told version of events. Yusupov claimed that he invited Rasputin to his home shortly after midnight and ushered him into the basement. Yusupov offered Rasputin tea and cakes, which had been laced with cyanide. Rasputin initially refused the cakes, but then began to eat the cakes. And to Yusupov's surprise, he did not appear to be affected by the poison. Rasputin then asked for some Madeira wine, which had also been poisoned, and drank 3 glasses, but still showed no signs of distress. At around 2:30 a.m., Yusupov excused himself to go downstairs where his fellow conspirators were waiting. He took a revolver from Dmitry Pavlovich, then returned to the basement and told Rasputin that he'd better look at the crucifix and say a prayer, referring to a crucifix in the room, then shot him once in the chest. The conspirators then drove to Rasputin's apartment, with Sukotin wearing Rasputin's coat and hat in an attempt to make it look as though Rasputin had returned home that night. Then they returned to the Moika Palace, and Yusupov went back to the basement to ensure that Rasputin was dead. Suddenly, Rasputin leapt up and attacked Yusupov, who freed himself with some effort and fled upstairs. Rasputin followed and made it into the palace's courtyard before being shot by Perushkevich and collapsing into a snowbank. The conspirators then wrapped his body in cloth, drove it to the Petrovsky Bridge, and dropped it into the Malaya Nevka River. Okay, so this guy had something going on which any sane person can only describe as supernatural. Does this necessarily make him any good? I'm reminded of a line of Tolstoy's, referring to the descent of the Holy Ghost at Pentecost. The descent of the Holy Ghost, too, had to be proved for those who had not seen the tongues of fire, though it is not easy to understand why a tongue of fire burning above a man's head should prove that what that man is going to say will be infallibly the truth. He's right. He's right. Finally, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing they don't burn people at the stake anymore, because I suppose I'm guilty of many heresies thus far against the Catholic Church in my ancestry. Finally, I give you the words of Matthew chapter 11, verses 2-6. John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard all about the things the Messiah was doing, so he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?" Jesus told them, "Go back to John and tell him what you have heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And he added, "God blesses those who do not fall away because of me." The supernatural, my friends, is well attested to. The supernatural has revealed itself through faith in our times. Here I give you some video evidence of what I believe is supernatural activity manifested through faith in our own times within a separate, or perhaps not so separate, tradition, that of the Hindus of India from 1995, and I'm pretty sure this qualifies as fair use. Yeah, I know. Capillary action. I intend to test this hypothesis tomorrow at Mother Mary of the Redeemer Church across the street. I know my man Jesus liked to sip a dry Okie Red from time to time. So I'm going to show up. I'm going to walk out of the liquor store with a box and a spoon. Just kidding. Come on, guys, give it up. You're still fighting the battle of dead white guys for 500 years, the church versus science. Your job is to explore creation, not to insult God. Miracles have occurred. The law of science have been exposed as generalisms. There are no laws, but that God wills them, and the quantum theory teaches us this. You're in bad shape if you need me telling you that. My single proposition with regards to the resurrection, it is a question mark, and thus far it's the first thing I left unsettled. It need not be settled. This man might have been resurrected and still be a sorcerer. This is not a proper basis on which to rest one's creed. I leave the question of the resurrection unsettled, and I remember Tolstoy. It is not easy to understand why a tongue of fire burning above a man's head should prove that what the man is going to say will be infallibly the truth. Speaking of which, here comes our final inquiry. What did this man say? Was it infallibly the truth? Let's venture once further down the rabbit hole of cognitive dissonance and recall some of these, which are likely some of the earliest written accounts of Christ's teaching. These from the Gospel of Thomas, recovered at the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. Jesus said, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion still becomes human." And he said, "The human one is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea, full of little fish. Among them, the wise fisherman discovered a fine large fish. He threw all the little fish back into the sea and easily chose the large fish. Anyone with 2 good ears had better listen." Jesus said, "The sower went out, took a handful of seeds and scattered them. Some fell on the road and the birds came and gathered them. Others fell on the rock, and they didn't take root in the soil and didn't produce heads of grain. Others fell on thorns, and they choked the seeds, and worms ate them. And as others fell on the good soil, and it produced a good crop, it yielded 60 per measure and 120 per measure." Jesus said, "I have cast fire upon the world, and look, I'm guarding it until it blazes." Well, I don't know how good your ears are, but could you tell me what he's talking about? Some of it's pretty good. Here we go. His disciples said, "Show us the place where you are, for we must seek it." He said to them, "Anyone here with 2 good ears had better listen. There is light within a person of light, and it shines on the whole world. If it does not shine, it is dark." Jesus said, "Love your friends like your own soul. Protect them like the pupil of your eye." Jesus said, "You see the sliver in your friend's eye, but you don't see the timber in your own eye. When you take the timber out of your own eye, then you will see well enough to remove the sliver from your friend's eye." Then we got, Jesus said to the Pharisees, Jesus said the Pharisees and the scholars have taken the keys of knowledge and have hidden them. They have not entered, nor have they allowed those who once entered to do so. As for you, be sly as snakes and simple as doves. This guy was kind of getting on the rabbi's nerves, I suppose. And then finally, whoever does not hate mother and father cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not hate brothers and sisters and carry the cross I do will not be worthy of me. Jesus said, "Whoever has come to know the world has discovered a carcass, and whoever has discovered a carcass of that person the world is not worthy." Well, There's some speculation that this man was uttering some very enigmatic secret doctrine to a select group of his disciples, including the apostles Thomas and Philip, and perhaps indeed the female figure of Mary Magdalene, who often figures prominently as somebody who was kind of written out of the canonical Gospels. Kind of wanted to make him look like a holy man celibate, but then they have a drink of wine too, so you're like, In apocryphal literature, you'll find she figures quite prominently. That's from the Gospel of Philip. The Lord loved Mary more than the disciples, and he often kissed her on the mouth. And Peter said, Sister, we know that the Lord has loved you differently from other women. He said to you, which you remember and which we do not know about. These Gospels are only preserved in fragments, so they cut in and out. We do not know about. Is it possible that the Lord has spoken with a woman about secrets we do not know about? So maybe the guy had a girlfriend. So what? Well, maybe that means something. After all, we see a pattern when we look at some of these false messiahs. We call them cult leaders. No, I did not just imply that Jesus was a cult leader. We see a pattern with some of these charismatic male types. Generally. In the final analysis, it often looks like they were out to get women. Doubtless there were people involved in the early Christian church who would rather portray Jesus as celibate. That's all I said. Well, I'm here to tell you, we only hear about one woman in this guy's life. It does not appear that he was some kind of Svengali out to seduce all the females. Mary even has a gospel. From Wikipedia, quoting the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Mary said, I saw the Lord in a vision, and I said to him, Lord, I saw you today in a vision. He answered and said to me, Blessed are you that you did not waver at the sight of me, for where the mind is, there is treasure. I said to him, So, Lord, now, does a person who sees a vision see it through the soul or through the spirit? In the conversation, the Savior teaches that the inner self is composed of soul/spirit mind, and a third mind that is missing between the two, which sees the vision. Then the text breaks off. The next 4 pages are missing. When the narrative resumes, Mary is no longer recalling her discussion with the Savior. She is instead recounting the revelation given to her in her vision. The revelation describes an ascent of a soul which, as it passes on its way to its final rest, engages in dialogue with 4 powers that try to stop it. Her vision does not meet with universal approval, but Andrew answered and said to the brethren, Say what you think concerning what she said, for I do not believe that the Savior said this. For certainly these teachings are of other ideas. Peter also opposed her in regard to these matters and asked about the Savior. Did he then speak secretly with a woman in preference to us and not openly? Are we to turn back and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? From the Gnostic Gospels. There's some interesting stuff in these Gnostic Gospels. What are we to make of it? Well, maybe Jesus had a girlfriend, and maybe like a lot of guys, he was willing to disclose certain things to her that he wasn't going to turn around and tell his boys. Sounds like Peter in particular wasn't too happy about this situation. Maybe the guy was human. When one encounters the figure of Jesus and attempts to piece together a coherent doctrine, there are almost more possibilities here than one can enumerate. The amount of contradictions present in the canonical 4 alone amount to an almost irresolvable dilemma, and that's without factoring in all these apocryphal texts and all these various possibly slanted passages from various Jewish, Greek, and Roman authors of the first few centuries of the Common Era. I more or less spelled out the worst case scenario. John the Baptist preaches the coming of the Messiah from the banks of the River Jordan. Perhaps his teaching is the true origin of what's come down to us as the message of Christ. Then this magician comes down from Galilee performing all sorts of miracles and saying all sorts of things which were barely intelligible, speaking in riddles. John acknowledges him as a savior. He makes a big stink at the temple. John winds up in jail having second thoughts, and his head winds up on a plate. And then a few years later, Jesus returns with a much larger entourage to fulfill the messianic prophecy. He fails. His disciples run away screaming, and he dies ignominiously. This is the worst case scenario, and oddly enough, it's not entirely consistent with the Gospel of Mark in my reading, wherein the Son of Man nailed to the cross looks up and cries out to the heavens, My God, why have you forsaken me? And perishes. Later Christian converts, perhaps including none other than the church father Paul, had the bright idea of commingling the teaching of John with the powerful heroic death and resurrection narrative of Jesus to invent the Christian dogma as we know it. This is problematic. This is a worst case scenario. I don't think that this is what happened. But I'm going to try to get into it in the next part of this, because I got over my head with this. This is going to have to be a series. So, goodbye. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be back, part 2.